Okay, so we're about to jump into one of the wildest, most complex legal cases you'll probably ever hear about. Seriously. It kicks off with a pretty localized dispute over a neighborhood in Washington state, but then it spirals out to include claims of global terrorism and, believe it or not, secret ancient land rights. All the information we're looking at today comes from this massive, self-published digital archive. It's a huge collection of court filings, personal testimony, and what's presented as forensic data.
So, how are we going to tackle this thing? Well, we've broken the case file down into 4 key parts to make it a little easier to follow. First, we'll look at the foundation of it all, the sovereign claim. Then, we'll get into the street-level events with the neighborhood nexus. After that, we're going to zoom way out to look at this alleged global digital web, and we'll wrap it all up by analyzing the legal strategy, which is all about piercing the immunity shield. So, let's get into the case of Shane Lozenich versus the state of Washington.
All right, so it all kicks off with the legal filing itself. No matter how incredible or strange the allegations get, and they do, it's important to remember that they are all tied to a formal lawsuit, one that's built on a very specific and pretty unusual premise.
And this one line, this single line from the court documents, pretty much sums up the entire attitude of this case. A notice of non-consent to quasi-governmental jurisdiction. It's this direct, almost confrontational challenge to the established authorities. It's a formal declaration that basically says, hey, your rules, they don't apply to me here. This really sets the tone for everything that's to come.
Okay, so let's get the official stuff out of the way. The lawsuit is what's known in legal terms as a quiet title action. And that's just a legal process you use to clear up any disputes about who really owns a piece of property. But, as you're about to see, the property we're talking about here is, well, it's absolutely massive. This specific court filing is the concrete anchor for all of the extraordinary claims we're going to explore.
And this is the core idea that everything else is built on, something called the Seattle Bremerton Majorat. According to the filings, this is a hereditary estate, which means it's property that's supposed to be passed down through a family line. The petitioner, Shane Lozenich, claims he is the rightful heir, and he argues that this territory acts as a sovereign security corridor, a place with its own set of distinct rights.
And just take a look at the sheer scale we're talking about here. This isn't some backyard dispute over a fence line. The claimed Majorat covers the entire northern half of King County. That means it includes all of Seattle, Mercer Island, Vashon Island, and major highways. The scope is just staggering.
So you might think a claim this huge started with, I don't know, some ancient map or a dusty old legal text. But nope. According to this case file, it all started with some very tangible, very street-level events in a quiet Seattle neighborhood. This was the catalyst that apparently set this whole conflict in motion.
The file lays out this really specific and kind of disturbing timeline of what allegedly went down on Midvale Avenue North. The petitioner claims there was a pattern here that just seemed way too coordinated to be random. It started with a big spike in 911 calls. Then, longtime residents just started disappearing. And right after that, their homes were sold off, the area got rezoned, and developers came in to tear everything down.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. At the exact same time all this was going on, the county was promoting a public initiative to remove old, racist language from historical property deeds. So you have 2 completely different stories. Was this a progressive social justice project? Or, as the petitioner alleges, was it the perfect cover story to quietly manipulate property records and cover up the unlawful sale of these suddenly empty homes?
And this quote from Lozenich himself really gets to the personal side of it all. It shows that these aren't just abstract theories. He claims they're the result of his own investigation after he himself was forced out of his home. He talks about digging into public records and finding what he calls this really alarming pattern of 911 calls.
Okay, and this is a major, major turning point in the story. The official response from the legal system to these very specific claims about missing neighbors? To declare them the product of delusions. In a competency hearing back in 2022, these exact allegations were used as the main evidence to find Lozenich incompetent to stand trial. And, as you can imagine, that finding changes the entire dynamic of the case.
All right, so if you thought it was already getting wild, buckle up, because this is where the case file zooms way, way out. From a neighborhood dispute in Seattle to an alleged global conspiracy involving technology and geopolitics, the claims escalate from what's called real estate crime to a worldwide digital web of terror.
And the key idea here is something called technologically facilitated terrorism, or TFT for short. The source material basically argues that this is how modern terrorism has evolved. It's less about physical groups meeting in person and much more about scattered individuals using the same digital tools we all use every day, cloud services, anonymous networks, to plan and carry out their activities from afar.
Now, to back this up, the case file lays out this list of major terror attacks and alleges this absolutely jaw-dropping connection. The claim is that the petitioner's personal IP address, his unique digital identifier, one that's been assigned to him since he was a kid, was secretly used as a digital hub for these attacks. The list tries to connect his physical location or even his travel plans to huge events like 9/11 and the Madrid train bombings, suggesting his digital identity was being used as a kind of pass-through.
And that brings us to what is, honestly, the most shocking and disturbing claim in the entire case file. The petitioner describes being subjected to something he calls voice-to-skull technology. In his own words, he's being forced to hear live audio of terrible events through his own devices. It's an incredibly harrowing allegation of what he calls a systematic, technologically driven assault. Now, to try and prove these aren't just ideas or delusions, the case file points to several pieces of technical evidence that were apparently submitted. This includes things like trace routes, which try to map how data travels online, network data logs to show a time-stamped digital trail, and even amateur radio recordings in an attempt to capture strange high-frequency signals. The argument is that these are real, verifiable digital events.
Okay, so after all that, the sovereign land claims, the neighborhood mystery, the global terror web, how does this all come together in a courtroom? What's the actual goal? Well, that brings us to our final section, which is all about the very specific, very calculated legal strategy at play here.
The real target of this lawsuit isn't just the government in general. It's these specific things called quasi-governmental authorities. A good example would be something like the Port of Seattle or a regional housing authority. According to the filings, these organizations have the power of a government agency, but they're insulated from the usual legal accountability and constitutional rules because of a complicated web of agreements between different agencies.
So how do you even try to challenge that? Well, the filings lay out a very clear 5-step game plan. It all starts with filing that notice of non-consent. Step 2 is to then formally reject the jurisdiction of these agencies altogether. After that, you argue that their actions were outside of their legal authority, which, if successful, would theoretically strip them of their legal protection. And the final goal? To force the court to recognize older, more fundamental land covenants instead of the modern agreements.
And that's really what this entire legal battle boils down to. It's a fundamental showdown. What has more legal weight? Ancient, hereditary land rights that are supposed to last forever, or the complex, modern administrative agreements that our current system is built on? That's the core question this lawsuit is trying to force a court to answer.
So in the end, the Lozenich case file, whether you think it's brilliant or delusional, it leaves us with this really big, uncomfortable question for our modern age. When harm can be inflicted invisibly through digital networks, and when the lines of jurisdiction are so blurry and complicated, how is a legal system that was built for a physical world supposed to adapt? How can it possibly see, let alone judge harms it was never even designed to recognize?